Very good evening, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students. A very warm welcome to this event on China's AI revolution and its implications for Europe. My name is Mathieu Burnet and I'm an associate professor in global law at Queen Mary University of London. And it is really my pleasure to organize this webinar in the context of the Jean Monnet Network on EU-China Legal and Judicial Cooperation, EUPLANT, but also together with the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on the Future of EU-UK Relations, which is also hosted by Queen Mary University of London. This event is definitely very timely. I mean, we are all closely following, indeed, the developments in the area of artificial intelligence, and indeed China's also commitment or intention to become a world leader in the development of artificial intelligence by 2030. And against this background, we also have to wonder what will be the consequences outside China, and in particular for us in Europe, meaning the European Union, but also meaning the United Kingdom. For this webinar tonight, I'm extremely delighted to welcome two colleagues I've been working with for a number of years now. Professor Stéphanie Balm from Sciences Po in Paris and Professor Rogier Kremers from Leiden University in the Netherlands. I just would like to very briefly introduce the two speakers. You can indeed find their profile online. Professor Stéphanie Balm is a research professor and dean of the Collège Universitaire at Sciences Po in Paris. Among her many publications, you can find the excellent book, which I always recommend to my students studying Chinese law, titled Ordinary Justice in China Between Facts and Law, which was published by the Presse Universitaire de Sciences Po back in 2016. Stéphanie's research has kind of shifted, in recent years, if I may say so. She now focuses on China as an emerging scientific power, the concept of science diplomacy, but also, the study of science diplomacy in the specific context of EU-China relations. Professor Balm will today address in particular what can be called this AI revolution in the Chinese context, looking at recent developments in that area, but also looking at the very ethical implications indeed of the development of artificial intelligence in China, but also beyond. And Professor Balm will be the first one to speak this evening. As a second speaker, we'll then have Professor Rogier Kremers, who is an assistant professor in modern Chinese studies at Leiden University. Something you will very quickly come up to realize when you will hear Rogier is that he has a very interdisciplinary background in sinology, in international relations, but he also has a PhD in law. After a few years spent at the University of Oxford, he moved back to the Netherlands a few years ago now, Netherlands, where he now leads a very important project, which is titled The Smart State, Big Data, Artificial Intelligence and the Law in China, a project which I would advise to all of you to follow closely, because this is really top-edge research when AI developments in China are concerned. And Rogier will talk in particular today about the so-called social credit system, or I should probably say social credit systems with approval form. And Rogier will be our second speaker tonight. Just a little bit of information on the way we will proceed. So we will start with short presentations by our two speakers. They've been allocated 15 to 20 minutes each. Then my suggestion would be that I will ask them some follow-up questions before indeed opening up the debate with the floor. And in that regard, my suggestion would be for the audience and all the participants to raise your questions on the chat. So please raise any questions you may have on the chat. I will collect them by the time we reach the Q&A session. So my advice would be the sooner we start with the Q&A, the most vivid and lively our debate will be. So that's it for my short introduction. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Balm, who I would like to thank again very much for having kindly accepted our invitation.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Mathieu. Please allow me to say this in French. So welcome, everyone, and welcome. I understand most of you are students, and students maybe to Mathieu, Professor Mathieu Bersney as well. So I would like to say really a warm welcome, and I'm very happy to join this Jean Monnet Network conversation on China's AI revolution and its implication for Europe. So it's quite an important question, and both easy and difficult to answer. So I'd like to make a few preliminary comments before I try to answer and to give hopefully a clear response to the question. So what I would like to say is that actually China, but also the EU and the US have national strategies on AI which have some kind of similar goals. What I mean is they do want to become the world leader on AI. Both China, EU, and the US. And they also want to emerge as the driving force in defining ethical norms and standards for AI. Then we can see that there is sort of common points between US and China on that regard, as at the national level, at the level of the government, there is sort of techno-utopian philosophy, which is quite widespread. And you can see it, represented by the Silicon Valley from the US side, and also by authors that you might know, such as, for example, Mr. Kaifuli, who has published an interesting book called AI Superpowers China Silicon Valley, which very much, spread the idea of techno-utopianism. But let's put it aside together. But if we now focus on China and the EU, and if we have in mind that both of them want to become a world leader on AI, and what I mean by world leader is from a tech perspective, business perspective, but also wants to be the driving force in defining ethical norms, then the question raised by the conference today, China's AI revolution and its implication for Europe, well, it's very important. Basically, what is at stake? What is at stake is a tech race between the EU and China, and also is a political battle. And the political battle, has two aspects, basically. One is what kind of science will emerge in the 21st century? Is it a science with or without soul? In French, we would say it's science sans conscience or science avec conscience. This is the first part. And the second part is very much the fate of constitutional democracy and fundamental rights. So if I had to, summarize in one key sentence, what is the implication for Europe, or what should be the strategy for Europe towards China in terms of AI, I would say the EU should engage China and should discuss and would need to engage China to move from only a perspective on ethical AI to human rights in AI. But it's still a long, long way. So in my very short presentation, as I just mentioned to you, what is at stake is a tech race and a political battle. I would like very much to address very quickly these two aspects. First of all, the implications for EU regarding China and the AI development is a question of tech and also business race, but tech race. And the second aspect is a political battle around the definition of ethics of AI. So at the first point, I would like to say that I don't know whether you are familiar with China. You've been recently being in China, but if for those of you who know, or if you had the occasion to read related issues on AI about China, you will see that there are explosion of applications of what is called deep learning in daily life in China. And AI is the area that should most likely give rise to one of China's breakthrough, what is basically called disruptive innovations. So far, China has been very good in developing innovation of use, but not so much in developing disruptive innovation. In AI, that's precisely where China can become definitely the first scientific superpower. by showing cutting-edge developments in facial recognition, in speech recognition, in self-driving cars, in AI chips, in healthcare, in robotics, in financial profiling services, etc., etc. Really, the daily life of China has been transformed completely since about, I would say, 10 years due to AI. And if you look at some very, practical, I would say some very, precise data, for example, in terms of global publication in the field of AI, in 15 years' time, China moved to to produce only 20% of global publication in AI 15 years ago. And now China has surpassed the US in the number of articles published in the field of AI. It's only one example among many others that show you the importance of AI in China's daily life. And it has been happening thanks to the development of 4 different waves of AI. And I'm here quoting the book that I mentioned in the introduction, the book by Mr. Greifuli. And the 4 ways of development of AI came with, first of all, the internet. The first era of widespread use of AI in China has been internet, okay? The second wave of AI was the development in industry and public sectors. And you will be interested to know that the specific public sectors that are connected with AI in China are banking sector, the hospital sector, and the judicial and court records. So the judicial system has been very much developed by the AI evolution in China. Just quoting here the judicial records, because I'm sure as students in law, you'll be very interested to note that. So the second wave has been the evolution in public sectors. The third wave of AI has been the evolution of what is called sensible machines, with billions of objects equipped with sensors, such as surveillance cameras, drones, and objects connected to each other. And I'm sure you know how much surveillance in China is important through AI. And I'm sure my colleague later on, Roger, will tell you more about it. And then the last but not least development of AI in China has been through autonomous machine. And this phase is probably the most spectacular and the most unpredictable one. It means autonomous means of transports and autonomous drones and all kinds of robots that you can imagine. And definitely there are big players, both of the Chinese internet, of the Chinese autonomous machines, of the Chinese perceptions machines, with companies that you might know, like SenseTime, Heathrow, the BATX, Huawei, etc., etc. By saying so, I have the feeling that you might know some of these names that I've just mentioned. So why is that so important, and why China has been so quick in developing AI industry? Is that because data are essential for the training phase of deep learning algorithm. And it's not so much that China generates more data than some other countries. For example, China still generates less data than the US, but China generates far more diverse data, what is called qualitative data. And that's what actually is needed to develop AI, is the qualitative data. It means very diverse data. There are 50 times more mobile payments in China, 10 times more online food delivery services, etc. And also China has developed through very specific business models what is called super apps. It's not a small app, it's a super apps. And of course, these super apps that you might know is WeChat, for example. And these super apps concentrate a wide diversity of data, social network, mobility services, public services, payments, etc., that give them the possibility to feed a set of AI's algorithm of unequal diversity using cross correlations between these data. So the pace at which the Chinese data generation growth is enormous, and it will definitely outperform the US in terms of, and the EU in terms of quantity as soon as next year. So to finish with the first point is the question asked by Mathieu was the implication for the EU considering the China's AI revolution that I've just started just to depict very quickly. Then I would say the very first one is definitely the tech race, the business race that implies the evolution of China. And from this, we can also say that there is a huge political battle. So you might have asked me, why didn't I start with the political battle? I could have started with it, but I think it's also important to develop it right now. So the implication for the EU with China's developing AI is definitely what will be the most efficient political system for a country to become a scientific superpower, and only an AI superpower will be defined as scientific superpower in the 21st century. So will it be democracy? So is democracy the leading force for developing tech, or is it dictatorship, or is it authoritarian system? And that exactly what is the question at stake. So just a few words about the political strategy of China in terms of AI. China has been one of the first countries to publish a national plan on AI, and this dates back to 2017. Now, nowadays, and there is this 2017 plan called the Next Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan of China, has been amended a few months ago. So we are now, using the second version of this plan. When China published it, it was quite, a few countries been quite amazed. It seems to be a little routine now that most of countries have developed national plan on artificial intelligence, like the US, EU, France, Germany, Australia, Japan. Most of countries have published AI plans, but China, when it did publish it in 2017, was quite at the avant-garde. And the ambitions affirmed is very clear. 2020, last year, China was supposed to be the major player in AI at the global level. And the idea is that in 10 years' time, meaning in 2030, that China will be the world leader in AI. And they have designed a very clear framework with a section on ideological principles from the 16th Party Congress, where the idea and the plan aims to, the plan is really that the party regain control of a sector, AI, whose development was outside the control of the party state until the mid-2010, the years 2010. And the framework also is designed as a development of what is called Techno Nationalism. So the idea of developing an in-house, tech science development for the sake of the nation and for the sake of civil-military fusion philosophy, right? What is quite interesting in this plan is that social-related issues are reduced to the benefit of the functioning of the state. Basically, in this national plan, what is interesting is that AI is considered as a tool to maintain social stability in China. And therefore, the development, for example, of AI in the public services, including in justice. And you can see the very fundamental differences with the other plan that I've just mentioned, like in the US, in France, and in Germany, where in these different plans, social issues, even societal issues, are at the heart of the plans. For example, the question of ethical issues, of social acceptance of AI, of the consequences of AI in our political regime, in particular in the fate of democracy. So, and another quite interesting aspects in China's AI plan is that the Ministry of Science and Technology is in charge of the implementation of the plan. It goes together with a small leading group, aims to be the strategic advisory committee for China's AI development, and it's completely linked and attached to the military sectors. So now a few words about the question of ethics. Do we find any, plan, any guidelines on the ethics of AI in the Chinese context? And the answer is yes. And it's quite interesting the way the narrative around ethics of AI is developed by the Chinese government and Chinese authorities. So first of all, we had to wait 2 years, meaning in 2019, before we could see a sort of, not exactly a comprehensive document, but a first step to develop AI ethics guidelines in China. So, and it happened in 2019, and it was not developed by the Chinese government, but it came from 2 companies, Baidu and Tencent, which submitted proposal to the governments calling for AI ethics in the sessions of the Chinese parliament. And the 2 leaders of Baidu and Tencent focused on 2 aspects. First, they focused on the international sharing of data. The idea of that, open data should be a key element of China's AI development, and that we live in a global world, and that this idea of sharing data and to have a much more open source, open science perspective on AI's development was very much very key for the development of China's AI. And secondly, the CEO of Tencent for the first time talked about tech for social good. The idea that tech should be designed for developing a society with good principles and socially friendly, I would say. After that, the Beijing Academy of AI, not the national one, but the Beijing Academy of AI developed a series of principles in terms of trying to align the AI's development in China with international development. And it's only in 2021 that recently was released by the National Information Security Standardization Technical Committee, it's a long name, a series of 8 principles defining what should be the key official AI ethics principles in China, and I'm going to list these principles to you, and then I will discuss them comparing with what is at stake currently in the EU, and I will very quickly reach to the conclusion. So the 8 basic principles of what is supposed to be today the official AI ethics documents are the following. First of all, and you will not be surprised, harmony. Harmony and friendliness, meaning that actually AI should help the development of harmony in Chinese society and should be friendly to people. Secondly, the notion of fairness and justice, basically the idea of no discrimination, it's very much the idea of inclusiveness, okay, which has been shared by the principles, the Chinese principles. So inclusiveness and sharing is a third principle. So sharing information, sharing data, and being open to society. The fourth principle is respecting privacy. Fifth, it should be safe and controllable. 6, accountability of responsibility. So we should be able to track what is the responsibility of companies or people using data. It should be open and collaborative. And last one is about governance, and it calls for an agile governance. It means a governance of data which is not too strict. Basically, it means which leaves some room of maneuver for the private sector, and it's not completely controlled by the government. And I'm going to say it's very interesting. This narrative is very interesting. And in this document, and I'm going to switch to the EU, but in this document, what is quite interesting is that the authors of the document present the list of basic principles of AI ethics in China as being completely compatible with the international guidelines of ethics for AI in the rest of the world. And when for example, you know what the EU is currently, thinking in terms of ethics guidelines, it's true. I mean, it's true that there are quite a lot of, comparatively speaking, it's not wrong to say that China's principles are not too far from the EU's principle. And I'm not going to introduce you to what has been the key initiative from the European Union in trying to develop guidelines principles for AI. So the story starts in 2018 when the European Union organizes a group of 52 members, from completely extremely diverse backgrounds with interdisciplinary backgrounds of social sciences and natural sciences. And they mixed that group of 50 people and they asked them to publish a guideline for what has been called, and it's very interesting, what has been called trustworthy AI. So trustworthy, bienveillant, somehow we can translate into French. And it's a document prepared by this high-level expert group in artificial intelligence. It has been published in April 2019. It's consultation-based, and basically it lists a series of requirements, and it explained that AI systems should meet a few principles in order to be trustworthy. And there are 7 principles. So they are asking for technical robustness and safety. So they insist very much on the notion of safetiness. They insist on privacy and data governance. They insist on transparency, on diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, on accountability, on environmental well-being, and pretty much that what they insist on. This is a very first version. They are now preparing a second version based on the different comments that are being made by national governments and also by NGOs. And I'm about here to conclude to say this, to respond to the question of what is the implication for the EU of AI development. So since April 29 that this document has been published on trustworthy AI, most of NGOs and members of political parties of different national powers in Europe have asked that the question of human rights, that the question of preserving the ethics principle of a constitutional democracy and a rule of law be placed at the top of the ethic guidelines of the development of AI within the European Union, and hoping it will become an international guideline. So basically, the discussions within the EU based on this 2019 document is very much to help all of us move our way of considering AI from simply the necessity to have an ethic guidelines to guidelines where human rights, constitutional law, and democracy is put right in the middle of it, and as we consider it as the most important dimension and thing to protect while developing AI, and these should be trustworthy AI. So, and then I'm going to conclude here. Of course, there are very few dialogues with China in terms of international AI, ethic guidelines for AI, and probably the very difficult time we live in the EU-China relations and in the relation with China and the rest of the world does not create a very, I would say, a timely platform to discuss it, but that's exactly what is at stake. So if we are in a situation where China and the rest of the world relations is not exactly smooth, and where EU-China relations considered very tense, while we actually do develop a lot of scientific cooperation programs on AI, and if we can't talk about ethics and the way AI actually transform our political system in a way that attacks directly the evolution of democracy, then the 21st century is not going to be the century for the development of rule of law, which I hope will not the case. So I'm very happy to respond to your questions and to discussion. It has been a very, very quick presentation. I'm maybe sorry for this, but I have to say the questions from the very beginning was quite broad itself. So I hope at least I could share with you some of the my current thoughts on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for these very thought-provoking introductory remarks. It was very good that you could set the scene, not only by looking at recent developments in China, their implications for Europe, but indeed flagging how difficult it is indeed to engage with such issues. I mean, just on a side note, just wanted to flag that indeed the EU and China discussed the very topic of ethical implications of AI in the context of the 2019 Legal Affairs Dialogue, which is one of the sectorial dialogues between the EU and China, but that there has been literally no follow-up, at least in my knowledge, following this 2019 dialogue. There are already many questions for you in the chat, Stephanie, but my suggestion would be that we move on to Rohir and that we go back to the questions afterwards. I also have quite a number of them, but I just would like to remind, the audience that you should not hesitate to use the chat function to raise questions for both Stephanie and Rohir. So Rohir, the floor is yours, but many thanks again, Stephanie. It was excellent.
Hi, everyone, and thanks Thanks, Mathieu, for having invited me. What I would like to do is follow up a little bit on three specific aspects. I would like to say a thing or two first about the broad idea of the smart state, the AI-enabled state, which is what I do a fair bit of my research on. Then I would like to move more specifically into issues like the social credit system and the very interesting reflections on AI and the use of technology that they throw up. And then I would like to conclude by reflecting a little bit on the discussion on China and AI in Europe, and where I believe we should or shouldn't put our focus on. So to start from the idea of China as a smart state, which is not my idea, it is the idea of the Chinese leadership itself. This obviously comes from somewhere. And as Stephanie already said, there is a very big sense of techno-optimism in China. Now, I would argue that techno-optimism to a certain degree is characteristic of the Chinese regime, but more broadly, it reflects a stance on technology that is not 100 million miles removed from what we have seen, for instance, coming out of Silicon Valley. I do believe, however, that for a number of reasons, China is taking this further. So in essence, if we can start with the ideological aspect of it, and that is something I published an essay on this last year at the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, NEXTEUK, in London, which, Mathieu, you're welcome to share with the participants. It's publicly available. And I go into it a little bit, and it comes down to an ideological position, and I use ideology here not in the negative sense, but very much in the sense of a worldview, something that everybody has, where the Chinese Communist Party has a very mechanistic view of the world and a very mechanistic view of society. In other words, it believes that, like natural reality, social reality is underpinned by objective laws, which one can understand. And in the same way that once you understand how gravity and combustion and propulsion and hopefully oxygen supply work, you can take a rocket and put people on the moon. You can also use these objective laws of social reality, not just to understand reality, but also to predict it and to control it. And so this is where the big focus in Chinese political thinking, but also academic reality on social sciences come from. It is this notion that this will help in discovering the objective laws that govern social development. and which can then help in propelling China towards prosperity strength. Fuqiang, the two big objectives that have dominated Chinese politics for at least the last century. So what that means is that if you believe that society is governed by objective laws, then that also means that you can run it, that you can engineer it as a sort of hugely complex machine, right? Something that is incredibly complicated, incredibly difficult, incredibly detailed, but in the end is capable of our understanding and our control. And that means that the task of governing becomes discovering those laws and then figuring out mechanisms to work those laws in order to generate human progress. And this is where digital technology comes in. It is a widely shared opinion among the Chinese leadership that digital technology, and more specifically big data, finally provides the computational ability as well as the information collection and processing powers that will make that promise of, you know, a controllable society on the basis of social science to turn that into reality. And so a lot of what this idea of the smart state is about, in a way, mechanizing the way that governance is done, making it more efficient, making it more effective, removing the human factor in many ways, because obviously the human factor can lead to corruption and abuse and favoritism and all of those other, you know, pesky problems that you get. So it essentially is creating a better machine for governance. And this is what you find all over the place, right? This is, you see this in the most banal of places, right? A lot of what smart cities are about is using smart cameras to do things like monitoring traffic flows, so you can program traffic lights more effectively. Or it's about assigning emergency services or energy use facilities more efficiently. But it is also increasingly about monitoring public opinion, partially, of course, in order to do censorship, but also partially because the Chinese regime also needs to know what is going on, and it needs to respond to that. And it can respond to that by ways of coercion, but it can also respond to that by trying to sort that problem, right? If there's one big thing that Beijing has learned after 1989, it is that putting tanks on the street tends to be very bad for business. So it tries to prevent that if it can. And of course, there are therefore hundreds of AI projects. And obviously, I've given you the core thinking behind that, but it would be wrong to say that that means that everybody therefore thinks in the same direction. And we will come to that in a minute, right? There are huge debates about what it actually means to transform this very high level abstract way of thinking into a workable reality for citizens, for government bodies, but also for the state. And one example that we can use for that is the social credit system, or at least, as Mathieu already indicated, social credit systems, because there is really not one completely integrated social credit system in China. Rather, it is an ecosystem of interlocking and mutually supporting components, you know, sometimes very closely, sometimes at greater distance, that share a common logic, right? And the logic is this notion that your individual behavior has consequences for the way that you're treated, on the one hand by the state, and on the other hand by businesses. Now, when it comes to the state part of the social credit system, you know, there's a very famous document that that I translated. It is easily, you know, the single most impactful thing that I've been lucky enough to do. Also, quite interestingly misunderstood. So I feel that a lot of my career currently is telling people about how they're overreacting to the social credit, to that document. But what the state social credit system is about is it is a response to the problems of building a market economy that then sort of spiraled a little bit. So on the one hand, the social credit system is about creating an amplification mechanism for the implementation and enforcement of existing laws and regulations. And on the other hand, it is a tool for the financial system to essentially, in a society that has until very recently been nearly completely unbanked, so people don't have financial records, how do you build up a financial industry that allows for credit to be handed out to individuals or to small and mid-sized enterprises if you don't have that track record? So part of what the social credit system from the governmental perspective is about is assisting the construction of that domestic financial industry, which is a really handy thing to have if what you're trying to do is build up domestic consumption. But let us focus on the first bit, right? That's the bit that gets the most attention, the law enforcement bit. And here, interestingly, for a discussion about AI, there's no AI present, right? From a technological perspective, the China's social credit system is really very 1990s. So in essence, what happens is there are national and local collections of data points. All of them are government data points, right? There is no data that comes in from the private sector into the government social credit system. And these data points are fed into a database. And these can be things like, for businesses, for restaurants, for instance, have you passed your hygiene inspections? Have you paid your taxes on time? How have you passed safety in the workplace inspections? And for individuals equally, it's about compliance with particular laws and regulations, right? If you've run through a red traffic light and there is a police camera there, the government knows that you've done that. If you've been convicted of something and you haven't implemented the terms of your conviction, the government knows that. What the social credit system does is it builds an additional step of both punitive and incentive mechanisms on top of direct rewards and punishments, direct punishments in the regulatory system. And that gets triggered when you do something wrong on top of. So the biggest punitive mechanism in the governmental social credit system is run by the Supreme People's Court. And what that does is if you're convicted of something and there's a list of convictions that qualify and you don't meet the terms of your conviction, you don't carry out your court order, or you don't pay your fine, or you don't pay back your debts, you then get blacklisted and there's an added list of sanctions on top of that gets activated. And there are all of these kinds of blacklists. Most of them actually focus on industry. There's a couple that focus on individuals in other areas as well. For instance, misbehavior on aircraft, right? You'll all know that there's an enormous list of stories about Chinese airline passengers, mostly first-time flyers, doing weird things in aircraft. Well, the social credit, one part of the social credit system purports to take care of that. But all of this is really binary. There is no AI mechanism anywhere, in the sense that there's no machine learning, there's no automated decision making really. There is nothing really that we could call artificial intelligence or big data in the government social credit system so far, in terms of spotting patterns, learning patterns, adapting software on the basis of patterns, adapting decision making paths, and so on and so forth. However, what we do see is that there is artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making in private forms of the social credit system. And here, obviously, the biggest example is Sesame Credit, which is the social credit program run by Alibaba, and more specifically, its financial subsidiary and financial. And that really comes from what I mentioned just now. The Chinese government wishes to build up a modern credit scoring industry. And it wants to leverage the fact that you have these mega companies that Stephanie alluded to already, generating all of that data. And so a couple of years ago, the People's Bank of China gave them permission to launch a couple of trial schemes on how they would generate a financial credit score on the basis of their data. And Sesame Credit was one of these programs. There were 8 in total. And so the way that Sesame Credit works is that it generates a score on the basis of a number of aspects of your behavior on the Alibaba platform, part of which have to do with your behavior, as in, do you follow the rules, but also, how transparent are you about your identity? And so, they are things like, have you broken the rules or have you been a good citizen of the platform? But also, how complete is your profile? How many friends do you have with a high score? And this is not because, as many people believe, this is about secondary punishment, right? Your friends have a bad credit score, so you get tarred with their brush. Rather, this is about making sure that you're not a fraudulent bot. If you have more verified identity information on the system, the likelihood that you're a fraudulent bot is smaller, therefore you get a higher score. If you have many friends with higher scores, the likelihood, again, that you're a fraudulent bot is smaller, so you get a higher score. Part of it is, again, about your compliance with rules and regulations, but part of it is also just, how much money do you spend on the program? And in that sense, Sesame Credit is really an interesting combination of a reliability scheme, as many platform companies have here as well. If you're on eBay or if you're an Amazon seller, you will have a ranking as well, or you're an Uber driver or indeed an Uber customer. So it combines that with the sort of loyalty scheme that you usually get with airlines. The more money you spend, the more points you get. And perhaps unsurprisingly, you will, perhaps unsurprisingly, or perhaps surprisingly, the Chinese government actually wasn't too happy about it, or certainly the People's Bank of China wasn't too happy about it as a way of providing credit scores, because they already sensed that this would mean that Alibaba, but indeed all the other 7 companies who were asked to develop these pilot credit schemes as well, they would have been judge, jury, and executioner in their own case. There were severe conflicts of interests between all of these private company and the final issuance of credit scores. So none of these 8 companies, in the end, ended up with a permanent license to issue financial credit scores. Rather, the People's Bank of China corralled them, set up a financial services company under a subordinate body, of which all of these 8 companies have an 8% share, and the remaining shares are held by that body that is subordinate to the People's Bank of China. And that new company can issue credit scores, right? So here we see something very interesting. Very often, I find that people want to sort of presume that everything that happens in China is some sort of manifestation of a grand central master plan. And usually it is not, right? There are issues of complexity and debate here that are really, really very big. Because even in China, even if you have a party that indeed, coordinates most, if not all, important social, economic, and political interests, the fact that they coordinate it doesn't mean that the clash of interests isn't there. And if you want another example of that, just look at the way that particularly financial and competition regulatory authorities have gone after Alibaba in recent months. But another example of that is the emerging legal framework for data protection that we are seeing in China. There is a draft personal information protection law out, which builds on essentially 5 years of work that has really started with the legislative process for the cybersecurity law, which took effect in 2017, and sort of all of some of the follow-on regulations. And the interesting thing is that after the cybersecurity law came out, we had a industrial standard on personal information protection. The Chinese have a wonderful way of coming up with deeply unfortunate acronyms. This document is actually called the Personal Information Security Standard. I'll give you a minute to figure that one out. And apart from that, regulatory authorities came out with a couple of draft regulations, but none of them ever passed. And part of the problem is political. The Cyberspace Administration of China, which is the lead regulator on personal data protection, and the Ministry of Public Security, which is in the lead of national security-related data protection, don't really see eye to eye. But it also reflects that to actually develop a workable model for personal information protection that appropriately balances individual interests with the interests of these big corporations, which, you know, Beijing doesn't want to get out of hand, but on the other hand, are incredibly important in China's economic and technological development agenda, turns out to be really difficult. However, interestingly, what we are seeing
sorry, just 1 second. If you could slowly start to move towards your conclusions, that would be great, just to make sure that we have enough time for the Q&A. Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. What we see in the draft personal information protection law, for instance, are limitations on automatic processing, where data processors cannot, without consent, just use individuals' data for automated decision making in a number of fields. I've been talking to people at Tencent who've been arguing for years that the reason that Europe doesn't have major technology companies is because it has too much privacy regulation. They've really been trying to stop this for years. But it seems now that the Chinese government is a lot more serious on data protection where it comes to companies. Note, and this is where I want to turn to my concluding remarks with regard to Europe, that what I'm saying is data protection. It's not privacy, right? Because the big counterbalance to all of this techno-optimism and all of these sort of big company intentions, which we have in Europe as well, is the notion of privacy as a fundamental right. Now, it is I've argued in published papers before that I don't believe there is such a thing as a fundamental right in Chinese law, right? The Chinese legal order just de facto does not recognize such a beast. And so, given the fact that there are no fundamental rights in Chinese law anyway, certainly privacy is not one of them. And what we see in the data protection framework, what we see emerging is a notion where the state wants to really intervene in the relationship between individuals and businesses in order to forestall some of the issues that have caused protests. And obviously, stopping protests is something that the Chinese government would really want to do. Make sure that these companies don't suck all of the oxygen away from the economic and social ecosystem. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a right of privacy that is also enforceable, most notably, vis-a-vis the state qua state. Right? There are also regulations about what individual state bodies and individual officials can do, but these do not translate into an actionable right of privacy against the state qua state. Now, what does that mean for us in Europe? The question really is, why do we care? And I'm not saying this in a dismissive sense where I want to imply that we shouldn't care, most certainly not. What I am saying is that it seems to us that we have a reflexive habit to look at whatever happens in China and see it as a problem because we don't like China. What we do not have, however, is a positive agenda for the future in these technologies ourselves. And this is something that is really interesting. I believe that in some way, Europe and the West more broadly has been intellectually lazy where it comes to technology, and China has not. We have essentially seen technology as a reflection of that wonderful post-Cold War political period where, politics was done. All we need to do is management, right? And what we need is more market economy and more liberal democracy, referendums. I say that as a previous British resident. Referendums obviously being a very good thing. But also, more private business, more marketization, and so on and so forth. And that means that beyond a couple of basic catchphrases, we don't really have formulated, we haven't really formulated a meaningful answer to the question about how we're going forward with technology in the near to midterm future. We haven't even really started thinking about it yet. China started thinking about this at least a decade ago. And while we may disagree with some of the answers that China has come up with, I'm sure very few of us would want a reconstruction of something like the Great Firewall in the British Channel, for instance. In other areas, China has come up with quite sensible responses in a regulatory but also a policy way against some of these challenges of technology. And it seems to me that already a convergence is happening between Europe and China on some of these points. The biggest one being cyber sovereignty, right? 5 years ago, if you said cyber sovereignty is a bit of a thing in Europe, you'd be laughed out of the room. Now it is European Commission officials themselves saying we actually need sovereignty in the digital space. And there will be other areas of convergence where we will do similar things, but for different purposes. This is something that I really want to leave you with. And I would like to explicitly contrast it with something that Stephanie said. Not necessarily because I disagree with it, but because I think it is another angle. And I think it's good to have a little bit of distance between the both of us, because then we can have a fun discussion. Stephanie was talking about the difference between democracy and non-democracy. And I believe that sometimes we do ourselves a disfavor by being regime-type fundamentalists, where we say that regime type explains everything, right? What we are seeing now between us and China is a struggle between democracies and authoritarian states, and one is in the blue corner, one is in the red corner, and may the best system win. And I'm not sure that that is always how it works. I am not convinced that democracy explains everything that happens in Europe. I'm equally not convinced that authoritarianism explains everything that happens in China. Sometimes states do things not because they are democratic or authoritarian, but because they are states, right? Some things that states need to do are the same. And so the question really is not only one of regime type, it's also one of competence, right? Before we start doing anything else, we have to make sure that we become competent. And that is going to be extremely difficult because, as we can see in the polities around us, and I'm saying this from the Netherlands, incompetence reigns supreme in European polities. So to me, the question is not how, will a democratic system beat an authoritarian system? To me, the question is, how can we move to competent government in Europe in a way that will allow European countries to develop a sustainable and realizable view for a future in which China inevitably will play a big role, in which our ability to influence Beijing is small and shrinking, and in which we still have to find a way to coexist. That, to me, is the challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Rogier, for what was a very thought-provoking presentation. I had prepared, an extremely long list of questions to ask the two of you, but given the number of questions we've received, on the chat, I will just try to merge them, if you like. So I will not try to summarize, the two presentations you've made. I just want to make sure that we can engage ASAP with the different questions which were raised on the chat. Let me start with 3 questions for you, Stephanie, then I will turn to Rogier just to give indeed some time to Stephanie to think about her answers. The first one, and I know that this is a question which is close to your heart, Stephanie, that is the question of what is, in your view, the role of the humanities and social sciences in the development of artificial intelligence? And in that sense, to what extent do the growing restrictions in the area of academic freedom in China, to what extent are those restrictions to academic freedom likely to impede China's scientific leadership in the area of artificial intelligence? So that would be a first question for you. The second question relates to data and data governance. You mentioned the fact that China is indeed draws some power from the huge amount of data which are being generated in China. That being said, next to the amount of data generated in China, China has also put in place some very strong limitations to the free cross-border flow of data. And the question is, what is the cost of that? What is the cost indeed of this imposition of strong limitations to the free cross-border flow of data through those data localization rules, principle of cyber sovereignty, and many other? And a kind of follow-up question in that regard, which was raised on the chat, was do you think that China's data protection framework will meet one day the adequacy conditions of the GDPR for cross-border data transfer in a similar way as it has been now recognized with Japan? Question mark. And by the way, I mean, the last, I mean, policy study for the European Parliament, which has been submitted on that very theme, was a few years ago before Schrem's cases 1 and 2. So it's quite interesting in that regard. I'm looking forward in that regard to receive your kind of update on that topic. And then last question, Stephanie, if I may. So you talked about the AI plan that China has developed so far. And the question is, how closely has China respected its plan so far? And do you think it will be able to carry it through to the end? So a more pragmatic question as to the question of where we stand in view of what was promised. So three important questions, and I give you some time to think about it now. And I will ask, so I can maybe ask my questions to Rogier, just so you have some time to think about it. Then three questions for Rogier. The first one is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic contributed to the acceleration of the development of the smart state you've been describing in general, but also how has the COVID-19 pandemic contributed to the development of the social credit system in particular, or the social credit systems in particular? So this is the first question for Rogier. Then a second question, you've kind of addressed that question in a certain way, but I think it would be great if you could probably come back to that point. Do Chinese people have a real control of their privacy rights in the application of AI technologies? Or is the sacrifice of privacy rights the necessary evil for the progress in the AI industry? So second question for you, Rogier. And then a last question, which is a theme which you did not address, Rogier, but it might be interesting if you could give it some thoughts. Could you please say something about robotic judges in China? Can human judges be replaced in Europe too? Question mark. So three questions also for you, Rogier. But before we come back to you, I would like to turn back to Stephanie for her answers on those three questions. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm not so sure I'll be able to answer fully to all these great questions, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try in a very honest way, just like a researcher telling you what I know, what are my hypotheses and based on which variables and what I actually don't know. To me, the first and the third question are quite related. So if the question is, what is the role of humanities? And considering the fact that humanities is not an area of discipline favored by the Chinese government, and will that impair the Chinese AI plan to really to meet its expectations? This question is very much linked to basically the third question, which is, how far the AI plan has been implemented, and do I think that China is capable of basically implementing this plan? So I will answer the question, the first and the third question, because I believe they are quite related. So my first reaction will be to say that everywhere and anywhere in the world, technological breaks are by nature unpredictable. So, AI disruptive innovation could pop up tomorrow from Beijing, Silicon Valley in Guangcun, or could be invented in the heart of Switzerland, or in southern part of France, or in northern part of Italy. You don't know, and it's not because there is massive amount of money which is dedicated to AI plan and technology in China, that it means that China will definitely be the scientific power of the 21st century, just because the ecosystem, the general business, political, scientific ecosystem in China is favorable to. But I think, having said that, what I can say is that the conditions are now reunited in China today, and much faster than in the global West. What I mean by global West in the US and Europe, So the conditions are now reunited in China, and much faster than in Europe and in Northern America, to develop an ecosystem that can create the disruptive innovations we're expected. I mean, in terms of data, not only the quantity but the quality, that's what I just mentioned during my presentation, the number of startups, the fundings, whether it's public or private fundings, the talents, the number of talents, and the way people are actually trained. All that means that if you look at the necessary variables that are needed for a plan on AI, such as the government plan on AI to be implemented, then I can tell you that the conditions exist in China. They exist and they meet the standards, and they are very, very, I would say, I mean, they are at the utmost of what they can do. So they have been developing, I mean, if we follow the plan since 2017, they have basically followed it very closely, and in certain aspects even faster. And on that regard, I would say that fortunately or unfortunately, but the COVID-19 pandemic has had a very important role in boosting innovation in AI in China. If you are interested, a very recent report published 3 months ago has shown that, you know, in terms of deep learning machines, sensitive machines, all what has been needed for, you know, facing the question of AI. So these are elements of answers to your question. Then and then I don't forget the aspects of humanities. Most of mathematicians and physicians, and I guess you understand that math and physics are the two key disciplines, and robotics as well. But I mean, some of the key natural sciences and hard sciences disciplines today needed to develop AI. Most of these top researchers, the first thing they would tell you is that they need humanities. That, you know, they won't be able to develop first class quantum physics without the introduction of philosophy. So philosophy, sociology, history, basically humanities, are very much needed to develop today's hard sciences. And it's not the perspective of someone coming from social sciences. It's exactly what physicists tell us. There are some, you know, big topics in maths and in physics that you can't solve without a philosophical background and a philosophical understanding of your topic. And I would like to share with you, and I'm now using my hat as a dean. I have been working very hard these last 2 years in developing a new diploma, which is called the Bachelor of Arts in Sciences, precisely combining natural sciences and humanities to train the next generation of social scientists so that they understand AI from within, but also the next generation of physicists or mathematicians who will understand social sciences from within. Because basically, the people coming from humanities, we do play a role in the evolution of highly digital and highly scientific, society. So now the question is, what about humanities in China? Well, humanities in China have been repressed very much. Constitutional law is not now forbidden in most of universities. Philosophy has been slowly but surely transformed into departments of Marxism, philosophy, and not to say Mr. Xi Jinping's thoughts, etc. And when you look at, if you pay attention to the ranking system of Chinese university, they belong to the top ranks, but not so much in humanities, except in law in particular. But in terms of history, sociology, philosophy, anthropology, all these key disciplines of humanities, China is not the place where actually it's been very much supported by official funds and by governmental funds. So basically, a lot of people say, it's the reason why China can't innovate. It's the reason why China will not become the big superpower, because they will be very hard in hard sciences, but very bad in soft sciences. Well, to me, it's an open question. I think my way of responding will be, they will reach a certain threshold, definitely. They, when they realize that they have, the scientists, need interdisciplinary studies, they can do what they've been doing in the past, which is to preserve certain labs and research centers and give them the opportunity to develop interdisciplinary studies, because it's good for the development of hard science, good for tech nationalism in China, and prevent the rest of university from doing it. And also, it might be the case that actually they will definitely develop a digital society and AI society without the the philosophies, the liberal philosophies that we have inherited from basically the Enlightenment period, and we'll develop it for the sake of a very strong and powerful state. So that might be the reason. Now, there is the second question. Maybe I'm too talkative, and I'm really sorry if it's the case, but there are so big questions, so I'm trying to respond it in a quite comprehensive way. Now, for the second question, I would say very quickly that the data protection regime adopted by the PRC remains, well, I would call it blurred. And this is for one reason: it's the absence of any unified legal framework. But this is not true to the data protection. This is not only true for the data protection regime in China, it's true for most of legal areas in China. And I'm sure, Mathieu, you will agree with this. There is no unified legal framework. But it is also changing. And I have to say that I've only read the law, but I haven't studied the laws. I will be very cautious because I don't want to say any mistakes. But since last year, a draft, is it still a draft now law? I haven't followed it, so I'm not so sure. But it's on the Personal Information Protection Law, the PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Law, that the Chinese government has been very eager to develop, because the Chinese government has been also very worried of the evolution of the misuse of data, not only in China, but within Asia in general. So this law has been drafted very much This law has been drafted based on the study of the Europe GDPR system. And so it has been, for example, one of the defaults of the system in China has been actually that the law enforcement agency didn't have much power, that the law did not guarantee very high penalties anytime that law was not respected. And actually, the new law, the Personal Information Protection Law, does address these issues, which used to be very absent in the Chinese data protection law. So I'm not saying that the law is perfect. Again, we need to study it much more. But I know that it's much more restrictive and even more, present more prohibitive measures, and basically lays down some general principles which are quite similar to the European GDPR. So just to say that is not to say that China is copying the EU and want the European GDPR system, but recognizes the fact that it's quite an efficient system. But definitely, even if it looks like the EU system, it would definitely have very different consequences, because the general ecosystem, and on that regard, I'm sorry, Roger, but the general ecosystem of a constitutional law system, which is what you can find in Europe, is definitely not what's existing in China. And therefore, the consequences for the law implementation will be very different. That's what I can answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for those very comprehensive answers. And let me send back the hot potato then on to Rogier. Rogier, I would be very grateful if you could stick to really 10 minutes max, just to make sure that each of you can get 1 minute to conclude, because I know that Stephanie really has to go at 6:30 GMT. So the floor is yours, Rogier.
Okay, I have a little bit more time to stay afterwards if it's useful. This would be normally where we would have a drink and a chat, right? So I'm happy to stay a bit longer if useful. But to come to my questions. Well, for starters, just to respond to Stephanie, you don't need to apologize to me. I fully agree, right? Constitutional legal frameworks in China are beautiful decoration. I'm actually writing a paper now about the personal information protection law, and it's sort of part in the broader data protection framework. And it's exactly that, right? It is imitating Europe. It is, or at least inspired by European approaches where it comes to the digital economy, but it does not translate to a constitutional right to privacy, because, as I said, the very notion of a fundamental right does not exist in the Chinese meaningfully. In the Chinese legal order. That's not a normative judgment, that is a research assessment. Come to the question, how has the COVID pandemic accelerated the smart state social credit system in particular? I've actually written a paper about this together with my PhD student, Adam Knight, which is available on SSRN. To summarize that, obviously, COVID is a very interesting stress test for entire government systems. I think certainly in Europe, that's something that we've all been fortunate enough to witness. And that stress test shows where the cracks are. And so when you look at the smart state, one of the big cracks that it really showed was data fragmentation between regions, right? China has been trying to build up this information state for quite a while now, but as so often in China, it's really something that is financed and organized largely at the local level. And so you get the point that systems in one town even can't speak to systems in the next town. You have incompatible data. And that then really becomes a problem when you need to build up things like travel databases, which are supposed to apply nationwide, right? So that is one of the big lessons, certainly, that the Chinese side seems to have taken away. Also, when it comes to the social credit system has been mobilized to deal with the pandemic, and in two ways. One, bits of the social credit system needed to be suspended because the social credit system is about, amongst others, economic trustworthiness. So if you've got a contract with someone to deliver something and you suddenly can't because of the pandemic, you should not be punished for that, right? Or if a certain payment is due and you can't pay at that point in time due to pandemic-related circumstances, you shouldn't have extra punishment. So parts of the social credit system were switched off. In fact, there was a program to help out companies with a bad social credit listing that would make medical goods or protective equipment. There were support programs to get their situation regularized more quickly so they could really help in fighting the pandemic. And as I said, social credit is about enforcing existing laws and regulations. And so the social credit system expanded to cover things like quarantine regulations, that sort of thing. So in the short term, you see that the smart state is mobilized to deal with the pandemic. Some things are switched off, other are extended. Think also about the health code apps, which were a big part of China's return to some sort of normal social interaction. Into the longer future, the pandemic has really shown where the cracks are, amongst other, in data solidarization, particularly between regions, also between different bits of government. And there will have been a number of lessons learned, which I think the Chinese government will be working on. Then second, do Chinese people have real control over privacy rights? Well, as I just said, they don't have privacy rights to have control over. But what the Chinese government is doing, including with this new personal information protection law, is making sure that individuals have more control over what happens to their personal data, how it is collected, how it is processed, how it is used, what access they have, when it comes to companies, right? And making sure that government regulators also have sharp enough teeth to make sure that companies really follow these regulations. There are also data protection regulations related to what, like I said, individual government departments and individual government officials can do with data, but these do not translate to a privacy right. So the answer is partial and instrumental, and I think Stephanie will gently smile at the recognition, but partial and instrumental are essentially the two fundamental words that help us to understand how Chinese law works in the first place, right? Right. There very rarely is a unified underlying philosophical or legal logic, right? This is about achieving goals. And the tools are used to the goals in an abductive manner without necessarily a sort of integrated philosophical underpinning, right? It bears here remembering, Stephanie mentioned, the liberal inheritance of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment obviously being a phenomenon that very much happened in Europe, very much did not happen in China. And I think that is a historical process that we really need to take into account to think, how then China engages with modernity as something that is imported rather than something that is sort of more locally generated. And then the last thing about robotic judges in China, actually, we have the good fortune of having the true global expert on this in the room. His name is Straton Papagianneas, and he is working with me in Leiden to write a PhD about exactly that. So he will probably cringe at the simplicity of my answer, but I've also been asked to be brief, so that helps. What it seems we are seeing so far in China is not automated judges, but it's AI-assisted judges, right? And I think it is true to say that in most legal systems, most legal cases are completely unremarkable, right? When it's things like your bread and butter, traffic violations or divorces or inheritance settlements or whatever, a lot of work that judges do is fairly monotonous, fairly predictable. And of course, many of us in the legal profession wouldn't like to think so, because we all like to think that we are more important than we are. But in reality, we're actually not that important. We're not that impactful. Most of the work that we do could theoretically be done by an AI algorithm, in the same way that 99.9% of piloting an aircraft can be done better by the autopilot than by the pilot. However, as human beings, we'd like to have the sense that there's a human in the loop. And certainly within China, there's also, we talk a lot about how China wants to use AI, but let's also not forget that there is a particular bit of what AI entails that the leadership isn't quite comfortable with, which is this notion that with machine learning, the algorithm develops on its own without control. And if there's one thing that the Chinese government, if there's one thing that the Communist Party of China really, really likes, it's control. So I think what we really need to look into is not this notion of robotic judges, but AI-assisted judges, where, at least that's what it says on the marketing material. AI assistants will help judges process more cases more quickly at lower cost, also by, facilitating things like remote participation. And frankly, some of these ideas, I think, could be developed within a European legal context without derogating from fundamental notions of the rule of law, right? There's a lot of legal research. There's a lot of things like damage computation that could really easily be done by software, and indeed in many countries already is, right? In the Netherlands, for instance, there are clear computational mechanisms for things like divorce settlements. So I don't think that in China we're going to move towards full robotization. There's always going to be a human in the loop, but that human is going to be more and more assisted by AI. And obviously you're then going to get the human reaction in the same way that pilots have come to trust the autopilot more and more and more. And sometimes that leads to problems. You're going to get into a situation where judges trust their AI assistants more and more and more. That's going to lead to problems. And that is simply the nature of the human condition.
Thank you so much, Rogier, for your answers and also for sticking to the time. We have 2 minutes left, so I just would like to give each one of you 1 minute to go back to any point or just to conclude. Maybe that Stephanie, you want to react to some of the last words or last part of the answer of Rogier. So Stephanie, just for 1 minute and then back to Rogier for the final one.
It's quite difficult to conclude. I mean, actually, we should have another session altogether. I was wondering whether there is no, any students frustrated because of one question that hasn't been, responded, or.
If you want one question for you, I can definitely find one for you and one for Rogier, if it's fine with you time-wise, Stephanie, because I know that you are the one.
Well, no, so maybe so. No, I'm very.
I know that you
have another commitment just after that, so I have to say sorry. But well, I think at least if the students who were kind enough to listen to us tonight, could really open their mind and their eyes to look at the link between the building of state power together with technology in today's world, whether it's related to China or other authoritarian systems, or even at home in the EU or back in the US. I think as a citizen and as a young citizen, this is definitely a duty for each of us, right? So science should be really, it's not to say that, we should stop science. It's not to say that science in itself is a bad thing, but it can only be trustworthy if it's transparent, if we understand it from within, and if we definitely do conceive the evolution of science within a political framework which is respectful to our fundamental rights as stated in our constitutions. So it might be something that you don't have in mind, but actually it's definitely what's going to change your life in the coming years. So just a warning maybe, and a call for a very enlightened understanding of these issues.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And by the way, I mean, I could see that our former vice president for research and who is also a professor of physics is in the room. And I'm very sure he will contact me tomorrow asking me information on this fantastic program you launched at Sciences Po, which is, I think, really an example that universities across Europe, but hopefully beyond and including in China, even if it might be more difficult, should definitely follow. So
welcome, great.
So thank you very much, Stephanie. Rogier, for maybe a minute.
I hope you won't consider me as too impolite, but I really need to rush to another Zoom meeting. Okay.
Let me then thank you very much again, Stephanie, for being with us. And this is hopefully just the start of a conversation. I let you go. Wish you a very good evening.
Merci
and
beaucoup.
Thank you very much again. Merci beaucoup.
Au revoir, Roger. À bientôt. Bye.
À bientôt, au revoir.
Rogier, then just to give you the same opportunity, then 1 minute for you to, in terms of something you would advise our students to take back home after this event.
Well, they should already be at home, otherwise they're not doing it right. But what I would say, in a way, it echoes a little bit what Stephanie said. But more broadly, it is let go of your assumptions, or at least recognize them. Because in essence, it seems to me that part of the weird period that we are in, and I think, there's a widely shared sense that in our society that things aren't what they should be, and that was already the case before the pandemic. The pandemic has just made that a lot worse, and made everything worse. There's a couple of really good books and documentaries that I would like to recommend. One is Pankaj Mishra's Age of Anger, which is all about the unrealized promise of modernity and the modern state. Another one, which should still be accessible on the iPlayer and otherwise it's on YouTube, is called Can't Get You Out of My Head by Adam Curtis, which is a wonderful documentary about how we got to this very weird stage. And in essence, what's really happening, it seems to me, is that we all got used to a post-Cold War period where everything around us seemed very normal and logical. And that gave us a very comforting narrative, a very comforting story to tell to ourselves about, about the world we live in which we were very conveniently blind to a number of things, right? We very often forget how much of our welfare is down to Chinese innovations, for instance. But in any case, that story is now coming to an end. Marx was not completely incorrect. We are facing changing times, right, where the previous situation is weakening under its own internal contradictions. And so we are, as I sometimes semi-jokingly say, the post-Cold War period is over. We are now in the post-Cold War period, which is going to be characterized by something else than the end of history idea, the Fukuyama idea that we've won the Cold War, liberal democracy plus free market capitalism is the natural state of being, and all we need to do is manage it, and then the future will be hunky-dory, right? History is back, politics is back, peace is going out of the window in a way that, frankly, I must say I find somewhat concerning. We are going to enter a new era. And any student of history will know that this is a very normal thing, right? We'd like to think that the wonderful world we see around us is normal. It is not, right? If you take one look at history, democracy is the exception. Prosperity is the exception. And so the question really is, moving forward, how can we cut away these stories about what the world is and that we've spun around ourselves and rearrange them into a story that is actually more future-proof before we get into a situation where we're so wrapped up in our own stories that we would rather have a major global crisis than update our frame of reference. To me, that's really the big challenge. And that is also why I was asking that question, what's really the impact on Europe? Or what does it mean for Europe? Well, what does Europe mean in the first place? What is Europe about? What is it that we're trying to achieve apart from 2% inflation and 3% economic growth? What is our mission? What is our purpose? You tell me that, I'll tell you how to deal with China, but not before. Getting a question in the chat about these two recommendations.
If I may, Rogier, just because I know that my colleague, who is hosting the event, has another event starting at which should have started. So unfortunately, we have to finish here. I must really apologize for that. So may I kindly suggest, if it's fine with you, Rogier, for the students who still had questions, to indeed send you an email, if that's fine with you, and maybe you could write down your email on the chat if those students want to contact you directly. Would that be a nice way to proceed?
Yeah, sure. Feel free to share my contact details, and otherwise we can always do this again. I'm not going anywhere.
That would be, I think I've seen many requests on the chat. We want another event with Rogier and Stephanie, put that way. So I will definitely do that again. Thank you so much, Rogier. As always, you are thought-provoking, critical. You think out of the box. It's entertaining. It's well-structured, just excellent. So really, thank you so much. A big thank you also to all the participants to the event, the students. I see there were many students from our double degree in English and French law, some of my law and globalization students. So many thanks for being here, but also people reaching us from all over the places, different parts of the world. Let's all stay connected. And thank you again very much, Rogier. Wish you all a very good evening and bye-bye. Stay well and take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.